After we got back from that traumatic potluck, we pretty much figured, okay, well, the naked hippies, they're over there in that next bay. We're over here in our bay. You can't really walk between the areas. It's boat access only, so we thought we were pretty safe. And then a couple of summers later, probably around when I was about 12 years old or so, we got back up to the cabin in Desolation Sound, and we saw this weird, kind of crumpled little canvas army tent set up in a cove right beside our cabin. And the guy that emerged was this weird hippie fellow who was actually squatting in the cove, and he looked like a cross between Willie Nelson and Charles Manson. And the guy's name was Russell Latosky, and he was a full-on freedom-seeking hippie dude who wanted nothing to do. He wanted to live beyond the margins of society completely. And I was fascinated by the guy. And it turns out that he was a downtown Toronto businessman at one point. Looked like Paul Newman with the short haircut and the skinny black tie and the whole deal. And one hot, humid day in Toronto, corner of Yonge and Dundas, he's crossing the street, he's getting jostled in his suit, and something just snaps in the guy. And like Forrest Gump, he just starts walking west. And he just keeps going and going and going until he hits the end of the road, which is a little town called Lund on the west coast. But that wasn't far enough for him, so he kept going further than that and ended up right beside our cabin. But he was a really cool guy, and he knew a lot about rock and roll. And so when he started asking me, you know, what kind of music are you into? What kind of music do you listen to? And my parents, all they listen to is greatest hits. So I'm like, well, we listen to the greatest hits of the Beach Boys, we listen to the greatest hits of ABBA, and we listen to the greatest hits of Billy Joel. So, you know, the best. Only the best. And he goes, oh my God, you've got to be kidding me. Like, do you know who Jerry Lee Lewis is? And I said, no. He goes, well, write it down, Jerry Lee Lewis. I said, okay. And he goes, do you know who Chuck Berry is? And I said, no. Write that down. So I would go back to the city and I would look up these records, and they would blow my mind as a 12, 13, 14-year-old. Then I go back and they go, okay, you like that? Okay, now check out The Doors. Now check out the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And when he finally said, check out the Velvet Underground, I was like, this is the greatest music I've ever heard. I am never going back to Desolation Sound. I'm going to form a band, and I'm going to put out lots of records, and I'm going to tour the world. That's what I'm going to do. Screw the cabin. It's way too far. And that's exactly what I did. I stopped going. I said, forget it, I'm not going anywhere. But it was Russell who turned me on to all those insurgent sounds that eventually led me to Moncton. And so this story that I'm going to read you takes place when I was a sort of an older teenager, and I was in the Smugglers and refused to go to the cabin in the summer. Since my parents were up in Desolation Sound so much in the warmer months, when I wasn't touring with the Smugglers, I was somehow entrusted with our family home in West Vancouver, BC. Many times, unbeknownst to my parents, it became the de facto parentless party house. One summer, when the Smugglers had an unusual amount of time off, the parties were frequent and growing in size by the week. My parents were blissfully unaware, and I was confident that I could clean up any mess so that they wouldn't notice a thing. Now, I'm not really sure what happened that one particular hot August night, but what started out as a small summer bash turned into one of those massive, out-of-control house parties that people read about in the paper every once in a while. Teens streamed in from all over the city. Word somehow traveled so fast that kids in the hundreds were charging down the driveway of my family home, a scene that resembled a cross between Degrassi Junior High and Braveheart. Soon, our house, our yard, and our street were jam-packed with partying teens. It was officially an out-of-control Canadian house party. The police showed up in force, and they found me, and they said that they needed my permission to clear the house. And if I didn't give them the permission, I would be staring at a fine in the thousands. And it was probably a bluff, but I was scared. So I gave them the green light. And the police blitzkrieged the property like the Allies at Normandy, chasing, screaming, drunken teenagers throughout my childhood home, over the couches, down the stairs, through the halls, and out into the yard. And as they are wont to do, several groups of teens resisted, fighting back against the man. A complete melee ensued. Police dogs were unleashed from the back of police vans. Billy clubs were swung. And a small group of my closest friends and bandmates watched in horror from my upstairs bedroom window as this bourgeois battle royale raged between the cops and the West Vancouver teens. And in the chaos, a cute smuggler's groupie flung herself up against me, begging me to keep her safe from the cops. And so, like Nero fiddling while Rome burned, I made out with her in the laundry room as the teen riot ensued outside. I mean, you know, what else could I do, right? She had to be safe. Eventually, after about an hour of mayhem, calm came back to a beer can-littered Bellevue Avenue. My neighbors slowly emerged from their homes like villagers who had survived a Viking raid, and they were livid. Wreckage and debris was strewn up and down the block, but amazingly, the only damage sustained to our family home was one solitary broken window. My family wouldn't be back for 2 weeks. I could clean up the street, I could fix the window. By the time my parents were back, most of our neighbors would have forgotten about it, or they would be on summer vacation themselves. So I was soaked in sweat. I was fresh from an awkward teenage makeout session and totally freaked out, but I was pretty sure I was in the clear. Unfortunately, those cops had really cracked some teenage head. Several kids had been whacked with billy clubs, and some were even attacked and bitten by police dogs. And the media got a hold of this story like a German shepherd on a teenage butt cheek and would not let go. Meanwhile, a couple days later, amid the secluded serenity of Desolation Sound, where there is no electricity and no cell phones, my parents and sister decided to take a day trip on the boat into the nearest tiny town of Lund. They stopped by the Lund General Store where Mom bought a few groceries, my sister Heather grabbed the latest Archie Digest, and my dad picked up a Daily Province newspaper. And he glanced at the front cover, and then he folded the paper under his arm. And 20 feet from the Lund General Store, my dad stopped in his tracks, his face contorting into this heinous grimace, as my mom described it. "What's wrong?" my mom asked him. Slowly, my dad unfolded the Province newspaper and stared incredulously at the front cover. Emblazoned across the top of the page in bold black letters was the headline, "Bellevue Bash Crashed." Beneath it was a full-color picture of a teenage girl showing a police dog's teeth marks in her bruised and bloody inner thigh. Filling out the picture, behind her was our West Vancouver family home. Jesus! Blank, blank, blank. Yesterday we did a reading at a church, and I couldn't read that for fear I would just burst into flames. My parents were on the next ferry home. They cut short their vacation in the cabin by 2 weeks. I was in more trouble than I had ever been in my life. My parents screaming at me that I wouldn't have a choice but to go back with them the next time they went to the cabin. I screamed back in stupidity that I would never go back, that I hated that place, that I had a music career to uphold, and my still bookish and nerdy and innocent little sister, Heather, was caught in the middle, flinching as various doors of our family home slammed loudly all around her. So that's the end of that story, and there's the headlines in the paper, and it made the national news as well. So back in the 90s, you would have read about it in Moncton, and it also made The National with Peter Mansbridge. Thank you. So now I work at CBC. So it's a little strange. I have talked to him about it, but he can't remember that story. We'll show the movie in a bit. I also want to thank Chapters,